Before we begin, just a reminder that this event is being recorded. So as you participate, know that you will be being recorded. And I've also put in our community agreements for the Anti-Racism Learning Series engagement and conversations. So just a reminder that each of us is responsible for creating a positive learning environment and self-managing as we collectively participate in these really critical conversations around racism, race, and identity, and how we all need to be engaged in doing this really important work around anti-racism, and making sure that we all are contributing to creating a safe and inclusive learning environment. And so I've just put into the chat some agreements that we've made around assuming positive intent, practicing curiosity, listening to learn and understand, reserving judgment and managing our emotions, being conscientious in the chat and when we participate to use inclusive language and apply critical thinking to new ideas. And this is a chance for all of us to challenge our own perceptions and actively participate and engage and share resources. So please use the chat to share links to books, articles, and other resources that you think will be helpful to the community. And then to just remember to be respectful and courteous to our SIETAR network and any folks we have who are participating and joining us from outside the SIETAR network. It is great to see all of you who have joined, and I will happily post those again for those who may not have seen them from the first time we've joined. So I'm posting those again. So there we go. They've been reposted in the chat. So again, welcome to each of you. This webinar is scheduled to run for approximately 90 minutes. And we will fulfill that based upon how much engagement and conversation we have going on. I'm really, really proud and happy and excited to have another friend and colleague that I know from SIETAR, who is here to be who is a longtime SIETARian friend and colleague. Natasha identifies as someone who is a racialized immigrant settler who lives on the stolen land of the Coast Salish in Vancouver, Canada. She was born in the UK to Sri Lankan Tamil parents and has been an interculturalist from birth, navigating cultures and difference. She later trained as a therapist and worked with marginalized communities and clients. And she has witnessed how systems and structures harm people. This led to her working with organizations as a facilitator, consultant, educator, and coach, specializing in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, decolonizing, and transformative change. So with over 25 years of international experience, her work has included government initiative facilitating community dialogues on racism around the province of British Columbia, as well as an anti-hate crime strategy. She's appeared on CBC, Global TV, and the media in issues of hate crime, systemic racism, and the police, bystander roles, diversity, and inclusion. So she has spoken as a keynote speaker and lots of other venues, including a dialogue with Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility in 2019. And she has facilitated racial equity retreats in Seattle, Washington. And lastly, she is the past president of SIETAR BC and is still active in our global network. And so we are for a real treat and blessed to have someone with your commitment to Jedi work, your expertise. And so after our last session that you did on fragility, I felt that that was just the beginning of the conversation, and that it would be important for us to bring you back so you and I could continue this really important conversation. And so I'm going to turn it over to you to maybe give us a refresh on what we covered last time before we move into conversation, new dialogue today.
Great. Thank you, Tamara. Hello, welcome everyone. It's lovely to be back as part of this anti-racism series that SIETAR Europa is putting on. You know, one of the things about this virtual world is you don't get to see anybody. And I don't know about you, but I find it really hard to facilitate or speak when I'm speaking into a void. And so let's just start. We have a poll that we wanted to share just to get a sense of who's in the room with us, who's here to have this conversation about race and racism. And so, Tamara, you've got a poll for us, right? I hope.
I do. I do have a poll, and it should be launching now. And if we can get a good return rate, I like to get at least over 90%.
And there are 2 questions, so don't hit send until you've done the second question. So the first one is, what is your racial identity? And then the second one is, how do you feel responding to a question about your racial identity?
All right, so I've made them as 2 separate polls, Natasha. So
okay.
we'll get the response to this first one. So if everybody can respond to this first poll, keep going, folks. Keep answering this poll. We'll close it, and then I'll launch the second one. Lots of relieved people in the chat.
Yeah. Yes,
all right, we're at 91%. Looks like we need about 9 more people to vote. So if you are there, I'll give it 5 more seconds. All right. So I am going to end that poll. I'm going to share the results.
Thank you. All right, so we have 76%, 73 people who identify as white, 6% or 6 people who identify as bi or multiracial, 10% who identify as a person of color, and 3% who identify as Black, and 4 people who said other, 4%. Okay, thanks, Tamara. You want to do the next
one? And I will launch that second poll.
All right, and here we go with responding to that question. Oh, great. The response rates are going up quickly.
They are. We are over 90%. We're at about 93. I'm going to give it about 5 more seconds in case there are any of our final people. We're up to 94%. All right. Thanks, Janice, for that contribution in the chat. All right.
Thank you. Great. So 23% are very comfortable answering that question, 46 comfortable, 29%, as you can see, uncomfortable, and 2% very uncomfortable, which is really interesting because had we done this question probably a year ago, I would have anticipated a lot more uncomfortables because we're starting to have these conversations. People are starting to get more comfortable, which is wonderful because that's what we need. People need to be able to have the conversation. Thanks for that, Tamara. Okay, so I need to close down this poll for me.
And Janice made that comment that 12 months ago, she wouldn't have been as comfortable as she is now. And I think that echoes your sentiment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm just gonna put my screen on. Hopefully you can all see it. but I can't see my screen now. There we go. All right, so welcome back. We're going to, as Tamara said, can you see that, Tamara, my screen? Yeah, good. Okay. So we're going to continue this conversation that we started back in July or August, I think it was. And I just wanted to kind of put things in context because these conversations are springing up all over the place in organizations that weren't having it for the longest time and organizations that were, because of the current context that we're in. You know, in the midst of this pandemic, as people have had to slow down and stay home, etc., and shift their behaviors, what has become really amplified and visible is the inequities and injustice that have been around for centuries. None of this is new, but many, many people who have been in their privileged, comfortable lives and suddenly have had to stop their usual pattern of behaviors are now noticing what's happening. And I love this quote: "If you fail to treat the current time you have wisely and with care, it will judge you tomorrow harshly, since it came to you, but you mistreated and abused it." So now is the time. Now is the time for us to act and do something. But why haven't we? This is nothing new. These are not new issues, as we said. So why is it difficult to talk about racism and what gets in the way? And I think I would like to invite you to just put some comments into the chat. And I'm going to stop sharing screen for a moment so I can actually see the chat. What gets in the way of having these conversations about race and racism? Because this isn't anything new. Shame. Thanks, Roberta. Depends on whom you are having the conversation with. Challenges our comfort zone, feelings, fear of messing up, defensiveness, being misunderstood, fear of backlash, sense of guilt, fear. Whiteness is normalized. Oh, wow. Keep up with the reading. Emotions, power dynamics, lack of practice, exhaustion, denial. Great. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that get in the way. Feelings and fear and shame and guilt are very much part of it. A lack of understanding, the incomprehension that Pamela's written here, fear of judgment, self-judgment and judgment by others, our egos, all of these things get in the way. And our cultures. You know, I live in Canada, and our history of multiculturalism gets in the way because we think we've done it. We're there. We're not racist. That's what happens over the border in the USA. And so this myth of multiculturalism, of politeness and niceness, that's very much part of the Canadian culture, also gets in the way. That we want to be seen as nice and not racist. And so what that fuels is this notion of colorblindness, that we don't want to name or see race. And so we can't have the conversations because it shuts it down right away. So before we go on into the conversation that Tamara and I want to have, we want to have a little conversation. I wanted to share with you, sorry, I'm getting back onto my screen here. Just a review of some of the language and terminology that we shared last time. And the reason I want to do that is because the language actually, and the ways we use the language and the definitions we hold for the words we use is one of the things that gets in the way. How we define race and racism is very different if you are white and if you are a person of color. And that hasn't really been addressed, that these very different understandings of race and racism have prevented us actually from having some of the conversations. So we know that historically this term race came out of originally naturalists that were exploring the world and trying to talk about different groups and the ways they differed, not just physically, but socially too, their patterns, their culture, their patterns of behavior and interaction. But very quickly, that larger, broader definition of race that naturalists were using got simplified into just the physiological differences and this notion of phenotypes. And during the period of European expansionism and slavery, it was even more emphasized because it helped justify the behavior of treating one group differently than another, of treating one group as less than, because in this notion of phenotype and biological difference, which wasn't true, but believed at the time, was that there was a notion that that white people were better than and more superior to people of color and to Black people. And so this notion of phenotype was around for a long, long time. And it got embedded into our systems and structures and our cultures and practices. So that even though we now know that there are no real significant, meaningful biological differences between groups, in fact, there's more similarity between groups and there's more diversity within a so-called group, we know that the realities of race in terms of the social, political, financial, and historical realities are real, in that there are very different experiences for people who are seen and read as white and people who are seen and read as people of color and Black. And so although we now refute this notion that racial groups are biologically real and different, we really understand race as a social construct. And this quote at the bottom here, Henry and Taylor, is one I like to use. Race is a socially constructed phenomena based on the erroneous assumption that physical differences such as skin color, hair color, and texture, and the facial or other physical features are related to intellectual, moral, and cultural superiority. And the concept of race has no basis in biological reality, and as such has no meaning independent of its social definitions. So we know that there are social experiences as a result of this notion that people are seen to be of a race or other. So we also talked about how racism is defined. And if you go to dictionaries, these are two dictionary definitions. Prejudice, discrimination, and antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior, and the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics and abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. So if you look at those definitions, there's the notion of the superiority, inferiority, but in particular, what the dictionary definitions do is they confirm what Robin DiAngelo in her book, White Fragility, talks about as how racism is defined by white people. And what she says is that racism is defined as individuals who consciously do not like people based on a race and intentionally seek to be mean to them. So already I notice what happens to your body when I define racism that way. You are an individual who consciously doesn't like people, and because you see them as inferior, and you intentionally seek to be harmful to them. And so if you think about racism being defined that way, then of course, if you are called a racist, you are seen as an individual who is mean and nasty and very intentional about that. And so, of course, it becomes an attack on your character, which you need to defend. And so that's how this term white fragility came about. What Robin DiAngelo talks about in her book, White Fragility, is that whenever we have these conversations about race and racism, because we have these very specific understanding of it being individual, that people are consciously doing it, and we start to have a conversation about race, particularly for white people, it's already starting to be stressful. just even the word race or racism can raise some stress. And so with a minimal amount of racial stress, it becomes so intolerable and it triggers a range of defensive moves, which is what Robin DiAngelo talks about and calls white fragility. And so some of those behaviors, those white fragility behaviors, are things like what's called tone policing. So it's not what you're saying, but it's how you're saying it. So I could hear what you have to say about racism, but you have to say it in a way that's not so attacking or aggressive. It's the way you're saying it, because I'm totally fine hearing it, but you're just saying it in a way that I can't hear it, right? It's the white tears and the emotionality. So when someone's sharing their story about, say, police brutality and the way their son was shot and murdered by police, and then that emotion gets so overwhelming that people start to cry, they start to be emotional, and the energy shifts to that person who's hearing the story, not the person who's telling the story. It shows up in silence. When people start talking about their experience of race and racism, and it's like the deer in the headlight, people freeze. They don't know what to say. They're frightened of saying the wrong thing. Some of the stuff that you just put in that list in the chat, right? You're worried about making mistakes, saying the wrong thing, offending someone, not having the right answer. And so in all of that, you shut down and you become silent, right? And so that's another sign of fragility. And one more just to mention is this notion of gaslighting. And in mental health and in psychology, gaslighting is actually a very recognized term. It's actually linked to narcissistic behavior, but it's about people who want to control other people. And it's a sign of abusive behavior. And it's when someone tries to manipulate another person's sense of knowing and reality to the point that that person then starts to second guess themselves, lose confidence, etc. right? And so we know that happens in abusive relationships, but think about it on a larger societal level, the ways in which as marginalized folk, people are told that their reality, what they experience is not real, right? It's not happening. Oh, you're being overly sensitive. I'm sure that's not what they meant. I know so-and-so is a really good person. They must be just having a bad day. All of these things that when you tell your story, it comes back at you as, no, that's not what you're experiencing. You're mixing it up. You're not understanding the whole context and the whole situation. And so it shuts down our own ability to really notice what's going on because we start to second guess ourselves. And so, those impacts of these kinds of patterns and interaction styles that happens when white fragility is triggered is that it shifts the focus back onto white people. When people of color and Black people and Indigenous people are telling their stories and trying to explain what's happening, it shifts the focus back onto the white person or the white people in the group. It shuts down any potential for dialogue. It maintains the comfort and the feelings of white people, and it has the impact of silencing people of color. So that was white fragility. And the reason I wanted to share those in that order is that that's how a lot of people define racism, as this individual understanding of racism as one person being intentionally mean and nasty and having very biased views about other people. But for many people of color, Indigenous people, Black people, for many people who are involved in anti-racism and anti-oppression work, we see racism as systemic and structural. So yes, an individual can have bias and prejudice, but unless they also have the social and institutional power that backs them up, they aren't being racist. They're being discriminatory, they're being prejudiced, they're being biased, but they aren't being racist. So racism has to include that social and institutional power, which means that this notion of reverse racism doesn't hold any weight. If you have a definition that's systemic, I can absolutely be prejudiced, biased, discriminatory to another individual, but I don't have the social weight and backing of the systems and structures that would allow that to be racist. And what I mean by that is you just have to look at the differential impacts of the judicial system, the policing system, the penal system on people of color versus white people. You can have the same crime, but the result will be different because the systemic and social power is behind whiteness. I see there's a hand raised there, Tamara. Shall I pause for a second?
You can answer it now, or we can hold it to the Q&A. It's up to you.
Well, let me go through these definitions because we want to have a bit of a dialogue, and that can be some time for the, so I hope that's okay. And if you really put pop the question in the chat, if you really want to ask it right now, and Tamara can read it and share it. So, as I said,
or post it in the Q&A, and we'll be sure to get to it as we get to the Q&A section.
Great, thank you. So to be really clear that racism is not just about individuals, it is about a system that advantages and privileges some based on their perceived whiteness and others based on being perceived as not white, as people of color, as Black, Indigenous, etc. Okay, and so when you define racism systemically and structurally in that way, then a racist, as Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist says, is a person who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction, as well as expressing racist ideas and ideology. So just being inactive, not doing anything, is supporting racism as well from this perspective. And so this notion around what he talks about is there are racists, and then there's racists and racism, and then there's anti-racism, but there is no such thing as this middle ground of not racist, because you're either perpetuating and supporting the current system, or you're actually trying to dismantle and create a new system. Okay, and so this is the definition of anti-racism. It's action-orientated, as I just said. It's a strategy to create systemic change that addresses, in this case, not just racism, but actually many of the isms, because all of the systems of oppression are connected and interlocking. We can't talk about racism without talking about not just white supremacy, but colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy, right? All of these things are connected. And so anti-racism is actively engaged in fighting white supremacy and systemic racism. So what is white supremacy? It's the ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to those of people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. So just take a breath for a moment and just notice what happens to your body when we talk about white supremacy. So the language of white supremacy comes out of critical race theory and socioeconomical systems where white people enjoy structural advantage and rights that other racial and ethnic groups don't have, right? Both on an individual and collective level. So if you think about it in terms of what we were just saying about this difference between defining racism as this individual set of behaviors versus systemic and structural, white supremacy is the ideology behind that holds up the systems and structures. It's the culture, okay? And as interculturalists, we understand culture. So the iceberg is something, at least in the global north, we use. I've heard some really great ways of using this in the global south. But this notion that we think about culture as we forget that there's 90% is usually not visible, right? Most people just think of the top 10%. And so if you think of white supremacy as a culture, one of the reasons we struggle to have conversations about it is because we tend to go to that 10%, the top part of the iceberg, which is socially unacceptable. It's the extreme parts of white supremacy culture. It's the KKK and neo-Nazi groups and alt-right groups. It's lynchings and hate crimes and using the N-word and swastikas, burning crosses, etc. Racial taunts. It's all that very overt racist behavior that most of us, I think, would be completely appalled by, right? But the reality is that below the water, that 90% are all the ways in which whiteness and white supremacy is embedded into everything we do that perpetuates this inequity and this injustice. So it's the silence, it's the color blindness, it's the notion of good schools and good neighborhoods and tone policing. It's the calling the police, such as the Amy Cooper situation, right? So it's all of these things that we don't tend to think about, that we are perpetuating and colluding with, because it's part of maintaining the system and the structure. So whiteness. Whiteness, Robin DiAngelo talks about as resting on this foundational premise. The definition of whites is the norm or the standard for humanness, and people of color, therefore, as deviations from that norm. Whiteness is not acknowledged by white people. You don't see it, you don't notice your own. It's the, you know, it's the culture piece, it's the water we swim in, we don't notice it, right? And the white reference point is assumed to be universal, it's imposed by on everyone. And that white people, as a result, find it difficult to talk about whiteness as a specific state of being that could have impacts on other people's lives and perceptions. So this conversation that we're having now, a year ago, because whiteness is so centered and for most people was not part of their awareness, this conversation was not happening a year ago because whiteness was so normed and centered. And I'll give an example of that. I mean, we've heard the examples around, you know, hair products and skin products and makeup and Band-Aids, plasters, all being centered on white skin. But recently in the UK, a medical student just created a handbook for medical practitioners. This is 2020. He created a handbook for medical practitioners to talk about what symptoms look like for major diseases on Black and brown skin. This is 2020, and medical practitioners are only just recognizing that when we use symptomology and definitions of symptoms as their lips turn blue, they have a red rash, right? It doesn't look like that on brown and black skin, and they're only just figuring that out now. That is the example, I mean, like a hugely great example of how whiteness is centered, right? And so medicine is practiced based on norming white bodies' experience of certain diseases and symptomology. And then the last term I want to kind of just remind everyone of is this term of intersectionality that comes out of Kimberly Crenshaw's work. She's a lawyer, a Black lawyer, and was working for a Black woman who was bringing a case to a car manufacturing plant about discrimination, employment discrimination. And when her case was heard, the law found in favor of the company. And the reason was because the law looked at racism as one thing and sexism as one thing, and didn't see that her experience was combined sexism and racism acting together, that intersectionality. And so what it was they said that the organization wasn't racist because it hired Black people. What it hired was Black men who worked on the shop floor. She was a Black woman, so there was no place for her there. And they said they're not sexist because they hired women, but what they hired was white women who worked at the front office in the sort of frontline work and secretarial and admin work. There were no Black women there, right? And so this intersection of race and gender created a different reality for this Black woman. And that is what intersectionality is referring to. It is the multiple oppressions and the impacts that they have to create a unique experience. So being queer and disabled, being gay and racialized, a person of color, being a woman and racialized, right? It isn't a term to describe the complexity and the multiplicity of our identities. And that is true too. We do have complex, multiple identities, but it's been a term that's been misused by many people, and particularly by white women, to describe their complexity of holding both privilege and marginality. And often it's a way of discounting some of their privilege. So yes, I'm a white woman, and I'm white, but because I'm a woman, I experience, sexism. And so somehow my whiteness is less privileged. And that isn't what the term intersectionality is actually referring to. So I just wanted to clarify that one, because I know there's a lot of misunderstanding about this term. So I think that are the major concepts that I wanted to cover, just to refresh us as we have this conversation tomorrow. So, and in fact, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so we can chat.
Thank you so much. I think folks are finding these definitions quite helpful. One of the questions we got was about whether or not these slides would be shared. And so I told them I would ask you if you'd be able to share these. So great.
Yeah, happy to do that.
So I have, thank you. So questions are starting to come into the Q&A, and that's great. So if you continue to have questions, so please put those in the Q&A. I have a few questions before we open it up to the larger audience. And so, so one of the things you talked about in the iceberg that folks really liked was about white supremacy culture. So what does white supremacy culture look like every day?
Right. So first of all, I would really recommend people read an article called White Supremacy Culture by Tima Okun and Kenneth Jones. And I can send a link to that. Sorry, I don't have it right now handy. But what they talk about is these components of culture, part of white supremacy. So the notion of perfectionism. And so you can't make mistakes, because if you make a mistake, not only is it a mistake, but that you are the mistake, right? So this notion of not being allowed to get things wrong and be a learning culture, it's a perfectionist expert culture, right? The sense of urgency, which we are seeing amped up now in this pandemic since George Floyd's murder, that things have to be done, and they have to be done now and done right, right? A defensiveness. So because you are seen as perfect and an expert, if someone then critiques that, there's defensiveness, right? Not an openness to feedback, but a real kind of rigidity to that. There is a valuing of quantity over quality. More is better and bigger and growing faster and bigger and more and more. I should say that some of these things are also very much linked to capitalism. It's not just white supremacy culture, but they're because these interact so much, there's some overlap. Paternalism is part of it. If you have this sense of being superior and better than, then there is a way in which you look down at other groups and you think you have the answers for them. And so you can make decisions for them. And that paternalistic behavior is very much part of white supremacy culture. So,
I think that's really helpful. I think one of the things that a lot of us who are practitioners of color and have been doing an exponential amount of diversity and inclusion training in the last 6 months have really struggled with this hyper response, right? So that it's one of those things that is it extremely positive that there has been a increased consciousness and increased demand for people wanting to learn and be educated. That is really a positive thing. But it then has also put an extreme amount of burden on practitioners to be able to respond. And then, of course, being asked to respond in a way that suits their needs and how they want to learn and increase their consciousness around that. And I think that has been one of the ways that we have talked about how white supremacy culture shows up, even in the efforts to challenge white supremacy culture and to be anti-racist, that it also emerges in that same effort.
Yeah, absolutely. It's ironic, but because the culture is so embedded, all these organizations, and you're right, I mean, it's wonderful that people are wanting and waking up to this reality and wanting to do something about it now. And that sense of urgency, and I've got to do it, and I've got to do it now. I mean, part of that also links into performative allyship. And let's be really clear about that too, that that sense of urgency is because they want to tick a box, some of them, and be seen to be doing the work without actually doing the work and really changing. And I, my auto response now speaks to this. And I just basically say, if this is what you want, a tick box, I'm not the right person for you, because that's not the work I want to engage in. So yes. And the whole way in which we navigate and negotiate contracts and stuff, it's all embedded in white supremacy. And so ironically, the call is for this work is landing mostly on people of color, the very people who are impacted by what's happening in the world. And in doing that, there's a whole bunch of stuff. I've just been involved in a contract where, they're pitting all these people of color against each other in this closed bidding thing. And we've just said, we don't want to participate in, we don't have the resources to go and do these proposals and bidding wars with colleagues that we know and respect. And we're quite happy to negotiate who's going to go for that, and the rest of us fall back. It's,
Yeah. It's been an interesting dynamic. And so one of the things that often comes up is this concept of centering whiteness. And I find, particularly within my role within SIETAR, my role within other nonprofit organizations and boards that I'm involved in, where I am very often the only or the one of few people who identify as Black, or a person of color, or somebody from a underrepresented or non-dominant culture group, and recognizing how even in the best efforts that we intentionally or unintentionally continue to center whiteness. So can you tell us what it means to center whiteness and what it looks like in organizations?
Okay, so this is something that just happened recently that I think kind of talks about the tensions that we hold in doing this work. So I am involved in doing anti-racism work with a number of different organizations, and I've got at the moment at least 5 organizations where we have split up on affinity groups. So we're doing caucusing, and we have a white caucus and we have a BIPOC caucus. And I'm facilitating both those sets of groups. And with the white caucus, we're using Layla Syed's Me and White Supremacy as the framework. And then I've got a whole curriculum that I've developed that I'm working with them on that. And we're going through that process of digging deep into what white supremacy is and racism and how whiteness shows up. And so these white folk are doing that. And the POC folk are doing some healing work using Resma Menaken's book, My Grandmother's Hands. That's the curriculum that we're using there. And so this one group, I had a meeting with the BIPOC staff, and they're frustrated and they're tired and they're angry and they're exhausted. And they basically said, why are we going at the pace of the white folk? Why are we centering their learning style, their learning needs, their learning process? Why are we doing that? And again, it was a hard conversation to have with them, because absolutely, on one hand, that's exactly what I was doing and what we're doing. We are going at the pace of the white folk. And at the same time, as an educator, as someone who believes firmly that, you know, you can only go at the pace of people's ability to go. You can't do much more than that. You can't force people, like you can take a horse to water, you can't force it to drink, right? And so how do you balance the fact that unlearning supremacy is a really huge task and takes time? And yet at the same time, we are centering whiteness, and that's that exact process. I don't know if that really answers any, but it's certainly one of the tensions.
Yeah, well, and I think it's part of the pieces that we have to explore and uncover and question, right? And how we do things, how we make decisions. I think in the different roles that I have, both as a volunteer and as a consultant in the work, is asking the questions about how and why do we do things, and you know, what is the impact of the way that we do things. And I think particularly even as interculturalists, where we have the knowledge and the skills to adapt and flex our style and approach, that still often, and I say this both about SIETAR and other organizations that I'm involved in, that there is still this really predominantly heavy white Western influence on how things are done, even when organizations are international, intercultural, right? And so, you know, and I see that with organizations, multinational organizations that I consult with, where, you know, folks in Asia Pacific feel really, you know, there's a lot of pressure on them for leadership, for example, to look a certain way, and not feeling that they have the same opportunities to move upstream and upskill, because their form of leadership isn't recognized as leadership, because our definition of leadership looks a certain way, right? And those deep roots.
Exactly. I mean, you know, this whole notion, and that's why I like thinking about white supremacy as a culture and the water we swim in, because it means we're all swimming in the same water. It doesn't matter whether we're black or brown or white. We're all swimming in that same water. We're all being told this is the way you have to behave. And there's plenty of people who are racialized, plenty of people who look like you and me, who are as white in their behaviors because they've adopted white supremacy culture, whether they did that consciously, willingly, or whether they did that as a survival tactic, because it's the only way to move up. If you want to progress in an organization, you have to, you know, drink the Kool-Aid. Women will say that absolutely about their abilities to succeed means they have to become more male-like, male culture adopting, right? And that's true of all of us.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's an interesting phenomenon. So I'm going to ask you one more question. Then we have quite a number of questions in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm not sure if we will get to all of them. Some of them are some pretty profound questions. So I will try to balance that. But I think one of the things that when we started this discussion tonight, and we asked the question about what gets in the way of us having this conversations, that people expressed, feelings of fear and insecurity, fear of being judged, fear of making mistakes, our culture or positioning, that there's a lot of things that really get in the way of us having conversations. And so what are ways that you mentioned briefly, but if you can just, when we're having conversations on race and culture, how does white fragility manifest in a way that people might be able to sort of now become more aware and maybe challenge their own behaviors and trying to have conversations on race and culture?
I mean, I think the biggest thing, and someone actually wrote ego in the chat, and it is, that's kind of what happens is we're human beings. We are not, this is one of the things about white supremacy too, it decapitates us. It privileges cognitive thought as if, intellect is the only thing. And the fact is we are humans, biological beings, and we have feelings, we have sensations. Our bodies are telling us things, not just our heads. And what happens when we have these conversations, because it brings in emotions, because it challenges sometimes our sense of self, our values and beliefs, we get emotionally engaged in it, and we can get triggered, we get defensive, we personalize it, because again, coming back to this notion of seeing it as racism is this individual behavior, rather than recognizing it's systemic and structural, we can't have a conversation that is layered, because people get so emotionally and personally tied into it as a slight against themselves. And so what happens in those moments is people might go silent, they might walk away. They can say, I don't want to have this conversation because, you're just being attacking and aggressive, and I'm not going to have this conversation with you. And that isn't what's happening most of the time. And I think what we need to do is and Robin DiAngelo talks about this, if you want to get in shape, you go to the gym, but it doesn't happen overnight. You have to keep going and develop the muscles, right? And slowly build up your strength and stamina. And that's what we need to do in these conversations. And for white folk, because most white folk have not been having this conversation. They have grown up and they have been able to live most of their life without ever having to think or have a conversation about race. And so white people need to develop the stamina to not personalize it and to sit and listen. And really listen without getting defensive and having comebacks and answers, and just really listen and let it sink into every cell of their being. Because most people are good people. I don't think, I'm not anti-white people. I have a partner who's white and my children are seen as white, right? So it's not about us and them, but it is about how do we reconnect to our humanity, to caring about each other and really seeing and hearing each other. And the reality is white supremacy has set up systems and structures and a culture that has prevented that dialogue from happening. And it serves white supremacy to maintain that. Yeah. And so that's what we have to break down. Yeah. And as white folk, if you have friends that are people of color, but you've never had a conversation with them about race and how it impacts them, then you have missed out on something. And there's a reason that conversation isn't happening. So think about that.
Thank you so much. I think that so much is that we haven't had a shared understanding of terms, which is why I think your definitions are so helpful. And so much about this learning series was recognizing that in order to have these conversations, that we need to, there's some learning that needs to happen for everyone. You know, I know a lot of organizations, the first thing they did were town halls and had these open dialogues, and certainly people suggested we do the same. And I thought, we can't have fruitful discussions if we're not all on the same page. And I think for all of us who are intercultural trainers and coaches, or any kind of trainer or facilitator or coach, so much of what we do when we're first working with learners is making sure we're all understanding and using the same language and terminology. And so thank you for that. And we will make the slides available to folks who are asking. So we have some questions. I promised Isabel I would ask her question first. So the question is, as races are not a reality, scientifically speaking, on what basis can we define a race? Is there a political definition of the term race? I have a feeling each political current or political institution has its own definition. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Racism is absolutely contextual. And so in each place and location, it's defined slightly differently. In the UK, I'm Asian. and the racialized groups are used by the government terminologies: BAME, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. I don't like the language, but that's kind of what it is. In Canada, it's BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? So there are different, you know, for example, in Canada, Indigenous people is a very big part of racism, because our whole history and our whole country was built on the racism of a genocide of Indigenous people that were here on the land first, right? So absolutely, it will differ in different contexts. But in general, the definition is a socio-political one. It is about the reality that there is no biological difference, but because of the perceived and assumed differences, people are treated differently and have less access to basic human rights: education, healthcare, housing, jobs, right? And that's the definition that racism is, and it will differ in different countries.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I know with the European Network Against Racism, that they talk about racialized communities, right? Because we know that race doesn't exist from a scientific, from a biological perspective, but we know that different communities, depending upon where in the world or where in Europe they are racialized, and as a result are affected by racism on a systemic and institutional. And so it may not be about skin color. And we see that happening in Europe, specifically with migrant communities across Europe. And that racialized communities have been more affected by police brutality and policing, particularly during COVID-19. And so I think that that's something that we need to be mindful of in our understanding of terms. So thank you. Tatiana asked, how does the concept of positive discrimination fit into the scheme?
So my understanding of positive discrimination, it might be similar to that of affirmative action, is to try and redress the inequities, particularly in employment, and the notion of the unequal playing field. And it's to kind of raise that. The way I've seen it work in the UK, when I was living and working in the UK, it was through things like schemes that allowed people to compete at the same level. So for example, the BBC, one of their sort of getting into their management courses, stream, you had to have had a university degree. But we knew that for many racialized communities, access to university was less because of the fact that they lived in poorer communities, had poor quality schools, and all that sort of feeds and trickles up into the ability to actually access university. And in the UK, university is much more competitive. There aren't as many people, or there weren't as many people accessing university. And so the BBC created a training internship program that was for Black people and people of color in the UK. And it was a 2-year internship so that when those management positions came up, that management process came up, they could compete on par with a university educated person. And so that's positive discrimination, is about how you level the playing field. I will say that, the affirmative action or the quotas is problematic. I mean, it is a way of addressing inequities and injustice in the processes that creates the uneven playing field, but it also undermines psychologically people. So if I get a job now, it doesn't matter whether there is employment equity or there is affirmative action or positive discrimination. People assume I got the job because I'm a woman of color, and therefore think I have less skill, ability, and competence. And that undermines marginalized folk. And that pattern is seen in workplaces time and time again, even in workplaces where there is no positive discrimination or affirmative action. And so the assumption that it's happening is deeply problematic, because more often than not, it's not happening. Very few places are actively doing positive discrimination and affirmative action. But everybody in the workplace assumes that people got in because of their identity.
Yeah, I saw that was, my university experience. Everybody was convinced that the only reason I was there because of affirmative action, right? And that was extremely challenging. Okay, so we have 2 questions from Chinello, and I am going to either lump them or pick one. And so I'm going to start with the first one. So how come you do not see white supremacy as the main ideological state of being that has led to the development of the transatlantic slave trade, genocide of indigenous communities, racism, colonialism, neocolonialism, cultural racism, etc.?
Say that again.
Maybe you do, so maybe you just disagree with the statement.
Can you read the question?
How come you do not see white supremacy? Yeah.
How come I don't see
How come you do not see white supremacy as the main? I think maybe that's perhaps a misunderstanding in how you presented white supremacy, because I think you do see white supremacy as the main ideological state of being.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do. So I apologize if you didn't understand that. I do think white supremacy is the foundational premise and ideology that has perpetuated expansionism, colonialism, slavery, enslavement of people, etc. Yes. So sorry. I am absolutely in agreement with you.
Great. Okay, great. And so Joe asked, why do you see capitalism as a vestige of white supremacy and not communism?
Well, capitalism I see as a vestige of white supremacy because of a couple of things. First of all, in capitalism, there is a few at the top who have all the riches, the wealth, the power, and there's the masses at the bottom. And the myth of meritocracy in capitalism, that you can claw your way up to the top, there is an underlying assumption that everyone can do that, and capitalism doesn't work that way. So whoever might climb their way to the top, there has to be, and capitalism cannot function without the masses on the bottom who are underpaid, underserved, and are seen as, worthless. I mean, we only have to see what's happened during COVID-19 to see who are seen as dispensable human beings in the world, right? So I hope that answers your question.
So just knowing Joe, I bet he has a few more questions, but we will go on. Because I mean, I think that maybe it's not that it's exclusive to capitalist societies, but certainly capitalism
and I'm not promoting
a very fertile breeding ground.
No, and I'm not promoting communism. I'm just saying, let's be real about capitalism as not being the panacea to everything. That the way it works right now doesn't work. There might be a different version, and that is the conversation that's being had around the whole environment, right? And sustainability. But the way it's working right now is not serving humankind, all of humankind, just some.
Okay, so the concept of intersectionality, does it only apply to people of color?
No, intersectionality is about how multiple systems of oppression intersect and interact to create something different and new. So race is often part of it, but it could be around class and gender. So we know, for example, this is an intersectional piece, when people get divorced, women tend to be more, to lose their sense of financial stability and are often living in low income and poverty, right? And so the intersection of gender and class, ability, sexuality, any of those systems of oppression can intersect. So if you're queer, if you are a lesbian or gay person and you're disabled, you are interacting with two different systems and have a very different experience.
Thank you so much. So, so then another question from Adil. Hey Adil, it's good to see you here. I struggle with this issue. Given that Euro-North American cultures are predicated on white supremacy, is not the system rotten to the core?
Yes. Yes and no. I mean, I think what we've lost in white supremacy culture. So, it's really interesting because white supremacy harms all of us. It harms everybody, not just people of color. It harms white folk too. And one of the ways it harms white folk is a loss of identity and culture. And so, there's a great book, How the Irish Became White, right? And you see groups that used to be, treated differently be absolved into whiteness. And so that notion of whiteness can be deeply problematic. And so, one of the things around cultural appropriation is because in whiteness and this disconnect that people have to their own histories, their own stories, their own culture, means that there's a void. And so in cultural appropriation, it's often people trying to fill that void by appropriating other people's cultures and practices, right? So, so yes, I think white supremacy is problematic. European culture isn't problematic. It's the embedding of white supremacy culture into that's deeply problematic.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of the discussion that I have, right? That this is something that we all have to be part of the solution, right? So that when folks often, feel, well, it either doesn't affect me, or two, I don't have the skill set, right? That this isn't something that people who are affected by racism can solve on their own, right? And it is something that when we talk about allies and advocates and accomplices, that oppressed, marginalized groups need help from those who don't experience oppression, whether it be around race or ability, gender, sexuality, etc. And so that's why this learning piece is so important, because we need folks to be able to all be part of this solution. So we have another question here from the ways that you can promote anti-racism and address white supremacy culture in the homogenous classroom with those who may not have experienced racist experiences.
Right. Okay. I just want to come back really quickly on the comment you just made about, oh no, it's just slipped from my mind. You were talking about, remind me again.
About everybody being part of the solution.
Solution, thank you. So I think absolutely we all need to be part of the solution because we're all impacted by the systems and the structures. And I think that when we are from our identities of privilege, whether it be whiteness, maleness, straightness, whatever, that in being part of the solution and actively engaging in it, we aren't doing it in ways that are paternalistic or patronizing, right? We don't have the answers. We need to be part of the solution, but the answers are actually more often with those that are impacted by the systems of oppression. Sorry, now coming back to the question about when you have a homogenous group, I tell you, that's a lot of the work I'm doing right now. A lot of organizations where 90% of the staff and the leadership is all white, 90% of the staff are all white, and there's often just one or two people of color in the organization. What's happened is that businesses, there's a couple of things that are happening in the world of work. One is that people are recognizing, certainly in North America, that maintaining this is not possible because the workforce is increasingly diverse and they can't maintain their organizations with just white folk. They're going to, the organizations are diversifying just simply by numbers and stats. So, but the problem is there's a pattern of not keeping good people of color. They're revolving, there's a revolving door and they're coming in and coming out. And that's about the culture and the experience internally in the organization. And so when I'm working with predominantly white groups, that's why we're doing these caucusing, sessions, is to help them really understand what the experience is like for people who are other, who are seen as marginalized in coming into work cultures and workplaces or classrooms, etc. And that involves doing, well, ideally, if we were face-to-face, it would involve doing some experiential work. And, one of the things that I love about the intercultural field is there's, the ways in which we bring in experiential learning into the work is really helpful in helping people tap into empathy and trying to put themselves in another person's experience and perspective, all of those perspective-taking kind of things. Virtually, we're not doing as much experiential, but we're still doing that through things like, now there's so much online, videos, podcasts, you can do so much more now. And so helping white audiences and white groups engage in some of that material and then process it, creating space to process it really helps.
So we have quite a few questions that I think are the same question posed in different ways.
Right.
And forgive me if you've asked the question and I've mischaracterized your question, but I think what these questions reflect is that within the European context, having conversations about race is more difficult compared to people's experiences of having the conversations outside of Europe, for example, in the US context. One, because we have cultures like France that deny the concept of race. There are cultures that might focus on individualism and the individual, so we don't recognize the complexity of identity. There might be institutions, countries like Denmark that don't recognize racism as something that affects their culture and or their institution. And so given this kind of mindset or attitudes or pushback, how can practitioners within a European context have these critical conversations on race and race and racism?
So I think the first thing is that it is different in Europe, but it's absolutely needed in Europe. I grew up in the UK. I spent 25 years of my life there. I go there all the time. I've traveled and worked in, different parts of Europe, and I am always meeting people of color in all of those countries who are frustrated and struggling to have this conversation in their own context. And those numbers are growing. So it's not something that's going to go away. It's not something that you can stick your head in the ground like an ostrich and think it will go away. It's going to keep going. And if we keep having the kinds of global crises that we have around the environment, around instability, et cetera, as people are moving, because we know that mobility is one of the biggest things that's happening, Europe is going to get more and more diverse. So this isn't a conversation that's going away. So each country has to figure out how to have those conversations in their context with the people and the communities that are there. But to deny that that isn't the experience of people in their communities is to not, it's a falsehood. It is a falsehood. You talked about France and this notion around, it's not just France, it's in many, many countries. I've seen it in Canada, this notion around we're being colorblind. So colorblind is, we don't want to name people's race because that's offensive, and we just see people as people and we treat everyone the same. Well, first of all, there's a difference between equity and equality. Treating everyone the same is not necessarily creating the same outcomes, right? I'll use a very crude example. No, I won't go to that crude example, but there is that slide that you see. I was thinking about women's bathrooms and men's bathrooms, washrooms. But the thing is, you can't treat everyone the same. I might need different things, and you have to accommodate for that. And that's the difference between equality and equity, treating everyone the same versus treating people as they need to be treated to get the same outcome, right? That's that leveling of the playing field that we were talking about earlier. But so I think that's really, really important, and that this colorblind notion that that we don't see and we don't want to name it because it's uncomfortable is problematic, because then we don't see the patterns. So for example, in Canada, because of our colorblindness, we are not collecting race-based data on COVID-19. We know that in countries that are collecting race-based data, we know the impacts of COVID-19 are hugely differential based on race. We know that people of color are the ones dying because of COVID-19 in Western countries, in the global North, right? So that's deeply problematic. If we don't collect the data, we can't see the patterns of pay inequity, of injustice, et cetera. And that comes from this notion of colorblind, where we don't want to offend people, we don't want to label people, we don't want, and that's problematic.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that I have found helpful in terms of sort of what, one of the questions I had for you was sort of, what do we know as interculturalists that can help us in this work? And I think that something that I have learned from practitioners like Farazana Nayani and other folks who are familiar with the intercultural development continuum and the IDI is that if you think of folks of being in minimization, right? Like color blindness is like being in minimization, and that our work is to move people from minimization to acceptance, right? All lives matter, minimization, Black Lives Matter, acceptance, right? And it's getting people to recognize difference in a more nuanced way. And I think that that model as a tool that we as interculturalists use all the time is a framework that works really well when we're talking about helping people move along the spectrum and their understanding around how race works. And I think particularly here in the European context, that's something in my own experience of living and working here, I have found unique, because I think one of the things I try to be careful of is when we say that racism is different in Europe, it also sometimes gives people the impression that it's somehow better or not as bad, right, as it is in Europe. And I often say it's like cancer, like all cancer is bad, right? Like we don't want to compare cancer. We don't want to have, some oppression Olympics about whose racism is the worst form of racism. Because one of the things that I learned over and over is that racialized communities in Europe have the same shared experience as racialized communities in North America. So while there might be cultural differences, contextual differences, historical differences, the impact on communities and the impact on individuals and the way it shows up within our systems, our organizations, our institutions is exactly the same, right? Like it's exactly the same. And I think that that's something that we have to be conscientious about. I mean, as somebody who does, we've all been doing a lot of this work, Americans weren't in the slave trade, right? There was no such thing as America or the United States. That the chattel slavery was a part of European colonization and expansionism and wealth development. And it was out of the European context and the British context that chattel slavery was formed and perpetuated the ills that it did in North America. And so I think when we look to have these conversations, right, that we recognize that the things that we think separates one country or continent from another on this topic does not really separate us that much, right? And that I think, and you can speak to this, that a lot of the things we know as interculturalists can really facilitate how we facilitate this conversation in our work, in our trainings. And so I'm wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the comment you made about racism and sort of seeing it as something from the US and slavery as something in the US, but not recognizing that the roots and the story started with Europeans going out, colonizing, and then taking bodies from one place to another place. And that was European countries that did that. And most European countries did that in some form or other. It is not an American story. It's a global story. And I think that, there's so much to say. And I've just lost my thought. Remind me again of the question. Sorry.
Well, you've got 5 minutes. And what I see, because we've had over 20 questions come in, and we still have questions coming in the chat. And what I think people really want to know now is some really practical strategies in terms of tools, models, go-to activities or resources that can really help people as they facilitate these conversations.
I mean, I think the thing I want to say first and foremost is that if you are white, to spend the time, do the work, and the ongoing work, because we're interculturalists. We know these are ongoing learning, lifelong learning, right? Cultures aren't static, they're constantly changing. And so we know we need to keep doing the work, to keep educating ourselves, to keep open to learning. And this is no different. So especially if you're white, it's really important to do the work around understanding what it means to be white. How has it benefited you? What are the things you've never had to think about because you are white in the context that you live in? And then I think the other thing, as interculturalists, this is something that has deeply bothered me for many, many years. And I'll say this, and I'm sorry, I don't want to offend people, but we are talking as interculturalists about cultures. And cultures are held by every group of people across the globe. Everybody has culture. And yet, it is a field that is dominated by whiteness. So where are the people of other races in this conversation? Why is it so hard? And it is hard. I mean, as a woman of color who's been involved in SIETAR for a long time, I will tell you, it has not been easy being in this space. And so I think as a profession, we owe it to ourselves to do that internal work, to really look and examine how we perpetuate whiteness and white supremacy as a profession, as an organization, if we do not look like the world in which we live in. And so, yeah, I think that's the work we have to do as interculturalists. We have to reflect the world.
Yeah. I think it's one of the things, right, that we as interculturalists say all the time. Well, I suspect most of us say all the time to our learners that it starts with self-awareness, right? That your own cultural self-awareness is a key starting point, right? And I think that, you know, for so many of us who've shared our stories of going abroad and living in a new culture for the first time, that it taught us so much about our own cultural identity. And I think that, you know, what has happened in the last 6 months is the same thing, that, you know, suddenly white folks have been exposed to their own culture in a way that they had not seen it before. And I think that that is so important because I think very often it can get confused. This conversation can get confused with wanting people to be punished or wanting people to pay or wanting people to say they're sorry. And I don't want an apology. I don't need, you know, individual reparations. What I want is for people to be more self-aware and to stop perpetuating and centering whiteness. That's all I want. And if you can do that, that doesn't even necessarily require you and I to have a conversation where you feel fear or guilt or shame. It's just about you recognizing, right, your own behavior. So when we think about, you know, our own ability to go into a different cultural context and assume the cultural rules and norms so that we fit in, right? It's that same might or flex that I'm, you know, that I'm looking for. I don't need anybody to come and say they're sorry to me. I just would like folks to do the work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to be a man. I'm happy being a woman. I don't want to be white. I'm happy with the color I am and my identity. And I just don't want to be treated shittily because of it. I just want to be allowed to be. And that's all that anyone's asking for. Yeah. And it really isn't about, I think that's the thing that's frightening in the conversation for some folk is that, you know, maybe there's a fear of retribution, that we will do unto them that what they did to us. And that's not what I want. I want us to coexist in some more peaceful, harmonious, compassionate, caring way. That's it. Because there's space for all of us. And so, but that means that when I tell you what I experience, that you hear it and you don't tell me that's not what I feel. Because it's not about you, it's about what I'm experiencing.
We're not
so, all right.
Yeah. Well, Natasha, it is always amazing to have these conversations with you. I'm not sure you and I have had conversations that weren't around these topics, because I find you one of the most amazing people to have these conversations with. I think in the years that I have known you, that I have learned a tremendous amount from you, around, one, my own privilege, two, around how we have these conversations and what we need to know to have these conversations, as well as the level of empathy required to have these conversations. So for that, I'm very grateful for your mentorship and friendship on these topics. I think everybody here is also sitting in a place of gratitude for what you have shared with us again today. I want to thank everyone for this very vibrant chat, the sharing of resources. the vast amount of questions that we would need at least another 2 hours to get through. This session will be posted on the SIETAR Europa YouTube channel. We will also be sure to share the slide deck with each of you. And hopefully in that email, we will be able to include some of the resources that you have asked for. Natasha has mentioned several resources, so hopefully we can include those in the email along with the slide deck to each of you who have posted and requested those. All of our past anti-racism learning series events are also posted on our YouTube channel, and our next anti-racism learning series event is coming up really quickly on December 9th. And that is going to be a panel that includes several folks, Ayla from Finland, Livingston, who many of you may already know from SIETAR Ireland, Ahmed from SIETAR USA, and Christian Erfla from SIETAR USA, looking at bias and intercultural theory and how is bias showing up in the very tools and resources and concepts that we use and apply in our work as interculturalists. So I invite you all to go to sietareu.org and register for that now. And thank you to SIETAR Europa virtual events team and Anne-Christine for your support here. And once again, to all of you who have been here, we appreciate you being here. Everybody have a wonderful evening and afternoon, and we will see you on December 9th.